I will begin. Welcome all of you. My name is Mateusz Strużyński. I am a classicist and philosopher interested in the history of philosophy, Platonic philosophy. First of all, I'm also director of the Institute of Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And this is the first lecture of a second series of online lectures, which I co-organized together with Edmund Stewart from the University of Nottingham. Last year, we had a series of 8 online lectures on tyranny and democracy in ancient Greece. And this year, we will have a series of lectures which are in fact a follow-up on that previous series. So you can access the previous series on the YouTube channel of the Faculty of Polish and Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University. All of the online lectures are recorded and posted there. So if you want a link, you can, of course, write an email directly to me, or you can find it on the YouTube channel on your own. And last year we had usually 45 minutes per lecture and then a discussion, and this is what we are going to have also today and in the following lectures. So I'm very pleased that the first lecture of this series, which is Tyranny and Freedom in Early Christian Thought and the Middle Ages, that for the first lecture we have Professor Richard Dougherty from the University of Dallas. And Dr. Richard Dougherty is a professor in the Department of Politics at this university. And also the director of the Leo XIII Center for Philosophy and Social Issues. He's a political scientist, and he also is interested in the philosophy of politics, primarily, or political philosophy. He recently edited, as well as contributed to the book Augustine's Political Thought, published in 2019. Which has been selected as a 2020 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. And he also contributed to the Oxford Guide to the Historical Reception of Augustine, entry on City of God by Augustine for Oxford bibliographies are forthcoming. So he is interested in Augustine, of course, but also in St. Thomas Aquinas. Soon he will begin as Dean of the Braniff Graduate School of Liberal Arts at the University of Dallas. And today, not surprisingly, Richard Dougherty will talk on Augustine, and more specifically Augustine on human freedom, politics, and theology in the Roman world. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I certainly appreciate the invitation to participate. And I would recommend to everyone that they go back and watch the lectures from last year. They're very fine and very informative, and set a high bar. So I'll try to meet that as best I can today. And so what I thought I would talk about is my original plan was sort of a larger scope analysis of Augustine's writings, but then I thought maybe it would be better simply to focus on the City of God. It's long enough, and if one wanted to make the case, I think for the argument that I'm gonna put forward, I think you can do it within the confines of this text, and so that's really what I'm gonna speak on. I have some footnote references to other texts, but I'm really gonna focus primarily on the City of God. And so I want to begin then actually with the opening chapters of Book 4, where Augustine commences his account of how the Roman Empire came into being and prospered, thus setting the stage in his argument for a consideration of the providence of God in human affairs. And that's an interesting principle, the providence of God, because he stipulates the notion of divine providence from the outset of the book, but he hasn't actually defended it to this point, I think, other than by an assertion. But the beginning of his treatment of the question, he already marks with some note of concern. For not only are we told that the relative success of the Roman Empire is not to be attributed to the worship of the pagan gods, but he raises also the larger question, that is, whether one should even desire empire, given the bloodshed that produces it and the hardships in maintaining it. And considerations of that question leads him to turn briefly to comment on the career of Ninus, the early king of the Assyrians. And he does this by way of a quotation from the 3rd century AD historian Justinus, Marcus Junianus Justinus. And I think it's worth considering what he says here as a way of thinking about the larger questions of political rule, legitimacy, tyranny, and human freedom. So this is the way he puts it. So this is in Book 4, Chapter 6. So this is the quote from Justinus. At the beginning of the history of tribes and nations, power was in the hands of kings, who rose to this peak of authority, not by courting popular support, but because their moderation was recognized among good men. The peoples were not kept in check by any laws. It was the custom instead to defend rather than to extend the boundaries of one's rule, and kingdoms were confined each within the limits of its own homeland. End of quote. Now, we might consider whether Augustine has in mind, in citing this passage, some form of a golden age of politics and social life, where rule is carried out with seemingly little by way of force or compulsion. I mention that because Augustine does consider such matters. As in Book 18 of the City of God, he cites Virgil on the time period of Saturn and Picus, making the claim that Saturn, which he regularly makes, that Saturn was likely a man by name of Sterkes, of whom Virgil says, that is of Saturn, the ages that passed under his rule are called the Golden Age. And here, in a not, that's from Aeneid 8, in a not uncommon jest, I think, Augustine suggests that this great god, Saturn, is really a human being made divine by the Romans, notable, he says, for being the one who discovered, quote, that fields may be fertilized with the manure of animals, which is called stercus from his name. In any case, that early primitive political or civil order, which we might characterize as the embodiment of the rule of man rather than the rule of law, that order gets upset by the rise to power in Assyria of King Ninus. And again, quoting Justinus here, Augustine says, Ninus, king of the Assyrians, was the first to change the ancient and, as it were, ancestral custom of the people due to his novel lust for empire. The Latin there is nova imperiae cupiditate, his novel lust for empire. He was the first, still the quote, he was the first to make war on his neighbors, and subduing people still untrained to resist, he extended his rule all the way to the borders of Libya. End of quote. So the expansion of boundaries undertaken by Ninus is for Augustine a material sign of Ninus's character. And Augustine suggests, even if we can't completely trust the account provided to us by Justinus or Trogus, who he is presumably citing, because as he says, as Augustine says, other more trustworthy accounts show that they lied about some matters. So even if we can't trust them completely, there is general agreement about Ninus's expansionist actions. And Augustine concludes the passage with this comment. This is in his own words now. But to make war on one's neighbors, to go on from there to further attacks, to crush and subjugate peoples without provocation, all out of mere lust for dominion, here it's sola regni cupiditate. What else are we to call this but armed robbery on a grand scale? So the point Augustine wants to make here is that Ninus's military success, which led to the establishment of a kingdom that he says lasted longer than that of the Romans, was seemingly accomplished without the help of the gods. And so there's no necessary reason to conclude that the Roman gods were responsible for the success of the Romans. And that, of course, is what he wants to focus on, really. But the narrative also allows him to make the point of connecting Ninus's shortcomings with those generally attributable to the members of the city of man, and specifically to the Romans. And that is the inability to stifle the lust of ruling. That lust of ruling, a characteristic Augustine drives home time and again, as applicable especially to the Romans. That lust eventually comes to overpower the Romans themselves, consuming them under its power. But before we move forward to consider other passages that illuminate Augustine's analysis of political actions and political actors who might fall into the category of tyrants, it will be helpful, I think, to try to establish a set of criteria for thinking through the Augustinian conception of tyranny or despotism, and how we might apply that to his broader perspective. Perhaps the best place to consider the question is in Book 2 of the City of God, where Augustine takes up Cicero's discussion in the De Republica of whether Rome was a republic, or in what way Rome can be said to have been a republic. And he introduces this discussion by way of considering the presentation by Philus in Defense of Injustice, which is found in Book 3 of the De Republica. Philus, under constraint to do so, he doesn't really want to do it, but feels compelled to, argues that the Romans depended far more on injustice than justice, and that they, like every nation, were moved by political justice and not natural justice. Laelius responds to him in the dialogue by defending the notion of natural justice and argues that no republic can last without being grounded in that justice. And at this point in the discussion, then, Augustine says that Scipio, the main speaker, returns to give, which he does in Book 3, to give a definition of a republic, repeating an argument which he has actually made in Book 1. But briefly stated, he says the republic is the common good of the people, right? Res publica, res populi. And taking up this definition, then, of what constitutes a republic, Augustine essentially just distinguishes between good and corrupt forms of rule and lumps together different good forms as if they were identical to each other, or at least sufficiently similar to not require independent analysis. And he doesn't provide that analysis, but treats the issue, in fact, in one sentence. So this is what Augustine says. So speaking of what Scipio does in Cicero's Republic, he says, he then explains the great advantage of definition, that is the definition of a republic, in debate. And he goes on to conclude from these definitions of his that a republic, that is, the common good of the people, only exists when it is well and justly governed. So a republic only exists when it is well and justly governed, whether by a single king, or by a few of the most important men, or by the people as a whole. And then he says, but when a king is unjust, in this case, he says, following the Greeks, he calls the king a tyrant. When a king is unjust, following the Greeks, he called the king a tyrant. Or the most prominent men are unjust. Here, he says, he termed the consensus of such men a faction. Or the people itself is unjust. And then here Augustine comments, for this case, he found no term in common use, right? So tyrant for the unjust king, faction for the unjust most prominent men, few, but no term in common use for the people being unjust. Although Augustine says he might also have called the people itself a tyrant. So when any of these things occur, the king is a tyrant, the most prominent are unjust, or the people are unjust and a tyrant, the republic, he concludes, is not simply flawed, as had been argued the day before, it is in the dialogue, rather, as logical deduction from his definition would show, it does not exist at all. I take this to be a remarkable set of comments on Augustine's part. For this reason, That is one of the core concerns of ancient political writers, the distinction between and among political regimes, right? A concern treated in part or substantially in Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Polybius, Cicero, and Plutarch, among others, is seemingly abandoned by Augustine, leading one to conclude that perhaps Christianity, or at least Augustinian Christianity, has nothing to say about the question of the best regime, or perhaps there's nothing important about the question that touches upon the central concerns of Christianity. But I'll return to that question. We don't here, though, want to lose sight of our question, that is the question of tyranny. So note that Augustine in this passage makes a fundamental distinction between just and unjust regimes, and goes on to describe the unjust regimes as tyrannies, or at least he describes the corruption of kingship and the rule of the people as tyrannies, using the term faction to describe the corruption of the rule of the prominent. Well, this seems to provide a rather broad swath for the understanding of tyranny, that it largely means corrupt rule, or corruption of any of the good forms of ruling. Now, if I might put that in a bit of perspective, the claim is perhaps not all that extraordinary. So though this is outside of our immediate concerns, there is, I think, in Aristotle, a sense in which we can talk, certainly we can talk about variations of tyranny or multiplicity of tyranny. So for example, in book 4, chapter 10 of the Politics, right? And additionally, I think one might say that there is a sense in which all of the corrupt forms of regimes tend toward tyranny, or put differently, that all corrupt forms have an element of tyranny in them, insofar as they seem to lean toward the more corrupt forms. But Augustine doesn't make that kind of more subtle argument, I think. But he does make another comment, which is germane to our interest. So we ask, why does he say, for example, in the passage I just read, that the Roman Republic, in Scipio's view, was not simply flawed, non-existent? Well, he says this. So why? Because he says there is no common good of a people when a tyrant or a faction has taken it over, nor is the people itself any longer a people if it is unjust, since it is no longer a multitude joined together by a common sense for what is right in a community of interest, which is the very definition of a people. Thus, for Augustine, the corruption of the Roman order that led Sallust, his favored Roman historian, to describe Rome as the worst and most depraved, really was much worse. And the Roman Republic, in fact, did not exist at all. His temporary conclusion at this point is to say that he will return to this issue, but that for now he will say that while there was no true justice in the Roman Republic, one could use what he calls a more plausible definition than the one which he and Scipio have posited. And according to that view, that is the newer, more plausible view, Augustine says, quote, "It was a republic in a way, and it was better administered by the earlier Romans than by their descendants." And then he says, I hope to return to this point, and he does much later in book 19, and I will return to it later, time permitting, which I think it will. But before we leave this opening account, it might be worth raising this point. In asking why Augustine makes the argument that he does here about political orders, that is, not drawing fine distinctions between and among the different forms of good and bad rule, one temptation might be to say that he does so because he wants to downplay the importance of political concerns and even attention to such concerns. Some evidence for that claim seems to be found in what I think is a key passage in Book 5, Chapter 17, the very opening of Chapter 17, where he asks this question. It's important, I think, to note it's a question. He says this. So again, Book 5, Chapter 17. "For as far as this mortal life is concerned, which passes and is over in a few days, what difference does it make under whose rule a person lives who is soon to die, just as long as those who rule do not compel him into anything ungodly and wicked?" End of quote. There is, I think, clearly a sense in which Augustine means for us to take this as a serious question. And it is a serious question for him, and I think for all Christians. The question is, does political life and the political order matter? Is it not the case that one can work out one's salvation in any set of circumstances one happens to find oneself in? Augustine's answer to this query, which he has put forth, is, I think, complicated, but in the end does not, in my view, allow us to abandon a legitimate concern with politics and the political order. Yes, in the end, I think Augustine does hold that one's salvation is not fundamentally linked to the vagaries of fortune that one might find inhabiting a particular regime, let's say even one unconditionally hostile to the Christian order. So there's an element of truth in taking the position on the irrelevancy of political machinations and rising above the mundane concerns of policymaking and political infighting to focus on the deeper foundational question of human existence and meaning. Yet that, it seems, is not Augustine's final or only consideration when assessing the question of how to orient oneself to the political order. It is true that much of the first 5 books of the City of God seem to be ordered at downplaying the significance of political life. As one commentator puts it, the rhetorical force of Augustine's portrayal of Roman calamities so disconcerts one that he nearly forgets the glory of Rome. One might very well be inclined to agree, and to some extent add that that's exactly his point. The glory of Rome is irrelevant, indeed a distraction for human beings. But that's not the whole story. It might be argued, in fact, that the initial force of Augustine's query here in 517 compels us to turn a jaundiced eye to politics in general and to Roman politics more specifically. That would seem a bit odd, given the context. Augustine is here closing in on an extended account of Roman politics, considered in intimate detail. So are we to think that he is closing the book on political analysis, and that once he has treated the subject, nothing more is left to be said about it? And indeed, that it would be brazen for someone to think there are still lingering questions that need to be addressed. Well, a quick glance, I think, at his argument will lead us to a more complex view of his position. Just 2 chapters after this passage we're focusing on in 517, so now we're going to turn to a passage in 519. So in that earlier passage, again, 517, seems to push us in the direction of rejecting the political world. In 519, Augustine restates a common refrain from the text, that true virtue is inherently tied to true worship, such that the Roman heroes were good men, quote, within the context of the earthly city, unquote, but not in the fullest sense. Even so, those qualities they did possess were more useful, he says, to the earthly city than their absence would afford. And then, in a remarkable comment, Augustine says this, quote, this is 519, as for those who are endowed with true godliness and who lead good lives, if they also have the skill of governing peoples, there is no happier state of human affairs than when, by God's mercy, they hold power. Such men attribute their virtues, so far as they are able to have virtue in this life, only to the grace of God. For it is God who has given them these virtues in response to their willing, their believing, and their entreating. End of quote. Now, note 2 things at least going on here. First, Augustine is compelling us to rethink already, just a few pages later, the question of whether the political order matters. Right? He says there is no, quote, happier state of human affairs, unquote, than when virtuous and talented individuals with the skill for ruling are in positions of power. So it in fact does seem to make a difference what the political order looks like. And human affairs would benefit from having good rulers. This point leads into the second feature of Augustine's claim, which results, I think, in a reconfiguration of sorts of the Socratic waves of laughter assertion in the Republic. That the greatest good there, right, for the city would be the union of philosophy and political power in the ruler, in the person of the philosopher king. Note here how Augustine crafts his argument. It's not the coincidence of philosophy and power, but rather of virtue, which he considers true godliness and power, that will produce the happy condition for human affairs. But note also what I think is a crucial part of his claim, that the virtuous and godly also must have the skill of governing peoples. Right? A skill, we note, which I think is not simply coexistent with virtue and godliness. In other words, Augustine does not say, and would not say, that what one should do is to find the most pious person you can and give that person political power. That may very well be a recipe for a disaster, politically speaking. And to dwell on this a minute more, because I think it's important, Augustine does not suggest that piety, or the larger life of virtue generally, brings in its train the skill for ruling. In other words, there's no necessary connection between the life of virtue and possessing that skill for ruling. So then, there seems to be a way of thinking through the contours of the skill for ruling, independent of the particulars of a Christian conception of virtue. Now, this is perhaps an arguable point, but his assertion suggests, I think, that there's a separate category for thinking through the details of ruling well. And that does not seem to be crucially dependent on understanding how Christianity might fence in or restrict those desirable qualities. In a similar fashion, one might suggest, and of course, when someone says one might suggest, it means I'm going to suggest. In a similar fashion, one might suggest, we see that Augustine routinely comments on the character of the Roman Republic and how it evolves over the centuries. And while it may be true that one is led to question the nature of the Republic, as he does, and how devoted it might be, on the whole, or in particular, to the pursuit of justice, Augustine regularly distinguished better from worse periods of the Republic, citing, for example, Sallust's argument that the Republic was at its height between the Second and Third Punic Wars, roughly the first half of the 2nd century BC. That analysis does seem to draw upon, that is, of the relative goodness of stages of the Roman Republic. That analysis seems to draw upon criteria, does not seem to draw upon criteria that are supplied by Christian categories of thinking about rule or the virtue of the people or their political order. So we're left to consider then what factors might be relevant to assessing the relative goodness of the Republic in different eras. And Augustine provides us, I would say, with at least a preliminary guide. And so how do we think about whether the Republic prior to Christianity was decent or just or unjust? It's regular questions one might ask. Did it produce peace? Were there gross injustices in the law that were avoided? Was there a moderation of the excesses of vice? That would at least be a beginning, I think, on providing a fuller account of the good of political virtue. One way of getting at that question, that is, of the relative goodness of different periods of the Roman Republic, would be, I think, to consider the character of the leading figures of Rome. And so I want to do a little bit of that, in particular in his analysis in Book 5, but it comes up in other places as well, Book 2 and 3. So in Book 5 especially, though, we're presented, of the City of God, we're presented with a panoply of Roman notables, all of whom have sacrificed tremendously for the good of the city. Right, and Augustine mentions here Junius Brutus and Torquatus, both of whom had sons executed for the good of the city. Camillus, who comes to the defense of Rome even after he's banished by ungrateful Romans. Mucius, who opposes Porsenna in the most courageous way. Curtius is sacrificed to the gods. The Daci and Marcus Publius undertake remarkable acts in defense of the city. Regulus is again cited for his heroism. Valerius and Cincinnatus that is Lucius Valerius, Cincinnatus, are noted for their personal poverty, refusing to sap the public treasury for their sustenance. Right? All of these characters are notable, undoubtedly. And in perhaps the most remarkable comment, Augustine in Book 3, and I mentioned this in my Oxford paper, Augustine in Book 3 comes to what I would say is a restrained defense of Tarquinius Superbus, the last monarch of Rome. Augustine says of him, Augustine says of him that he was driven out of Rome for a crime he did not commit. It was the violation of Lucretia, right? The act was done by his son. And what Augustine says, in fact, is, quote, "We do not know what he would have done if the evil deed of his son had been brought to his notice." After all, it was not as if the Romans were incapable of punishing their own sons. We've just seen examples of that. Indeed, Augustine adds, quote, that without seeking or ascertaining his judgment in the matter, that is Tarquin's, the people deprived him of his authority. And yet, as he notes in this very passage in Book 3, Tarquin ended up living out his life privately in nearby Tusculum, apparently undisturbed by the Rome that he, Tarquin, had himself exhausted, including, of course, as Augustine notes, having killed his father-in-law to attain the throne. And some argue that Tarquin had also killed his sister and brother. That's a matter of some dispute, I think. And yet what Augustine says of him here is important for our purposes. He says this, quote, "But this Tarquin the Romans called not the cruel nor the infamous, but the proud. Perhaps because in their own pride, they could not bear the pride of another." Right? For Augustine, this reflects more on the Romans than on Tarquin, for they seem to have been content with removing him from power because they couldn't bear another claiming the mantle of the Romans for himself. Back in Book 5, one further comment, though, Augustine also writes about Marcus Cato and Caesar, and gives something of a defense of both of them. Now, this is a bit muddier because in the argument, he's quoting Sallust, and it's sometimes unclear whether he's speaking in his own, where he's speaking in his own name and where he's simply presenting Sallus's judgment. But it's more remarkable here, and this is especially true given his extended criticism in Book 1 of Lucretia. But we might note something of a matter which I think is worth considering, and that is the beginning and the end of the Republic are marked by suicides, right? The suicide of Lucretia, and then many suicides at the time of at the end of the Republic, but especially of Cato is the one most spoken of, perhaps. And Augustine, of course, is unwilling to defend Lucretia's suicide, but he does recognize the significance of it in the political significance of it, and that it was a public act, right? And it had the consequence of jettisoning people towards the removal of Tarquin. But back in a comment that he makes back in Book 2, I wanted to refer to before moving on, and that is he's attempted to show in Book 2 that the Roman gods were in fact not responsible for the earthly success of the Romans, and he asserts that the gods provided nothing by way of precepts to promote the moral life or goodness of the Republic, and we have no evidence that they actually did. And so he asks this question, and I mention this because he's referring here in Book 2 to some of these Roman heroes. And here he says this. This is in Book 2, Chapter 22. "What laws given to the city by the gods did the Gracchi despise when they threw everything into turmoil by their seditions? What laws from the gods did Marius and Cinna and Carbo treat with contempt when they proceeded to civil wars? And finally, what law from the gods did Sulla himself reject, whose life, character, and actions, as described by Sallust and other historical writers, would horrify anyone?" I mention this in part because he speaks of these major figures, but also because a number of he makes different comments at different times about some of these characters, and one of the interesting questions I think is what he thinks in the end of the Gracchi, because he seems to accept that sometimes he seems to be somewhat sympathetic to the Gracchi's response to injustice in the Republic, and yet he also seems to criticize their actions, which led to sedition and ultimately, in a way, to the deterioration of the Republic. But back to the point about in Book 5, his treatment of the Roman heroes. The point is, I think, that these are all Romans who have undertaken significant actions for the good of the city, and that they should be recognized in some fashion. And it may be the case that they were all, or most of them, driven by a desire for power. But there is a limiting element in that desire that's useful to the city. And he puts it this way. So this is Augustine in Book 5. One who desires to rule and command, but who lacks that love of glory which will deter him from displeasing men of good judgment, will very often seek to obtain what he loves, even by the most blatant acts of wickedness. He who loves glory, therefore, will either ascend to it by the true way or strive for it by treachery and deceit, wishing to seem good even though he is not. And so he says, the person who despises glory but is avid for domination outdoes even the beasts in the vices of cruelty and self-indulgence. Some Romans were like this. They had lost any concern for their good name, but suffered no lack of desire for domination. Right, that's dominationis cupiditate, the phrase he uses there. And he says, history tells us there were many like this vice. But, and he goes on to say more about Nero and his cruelty. But Augustine doesn't want the reader to think that the presence of such rule or such corrupt individuals is somehow inexplicable or contrary to the divine plan for human relations. Instead, he notes, quote, but the power of leadership is given even to such men as this only by the providence of the supreme God, when he judges that the condition of human affairs is deserving of such lords. And he says, the divine voice is clear on this matter, for the wisdom of God speaks as follows, now citing Proverbs 8:15, by me kings reign and tyrants possess the land. And then he says, it might be supposed that the word tyrant here means not bad and unjust kings, but brave men, as in the ancient sense in which Virgil uses it when he says, now he quotes Aeneid 7:266, it shall be a sign of peace to me to have touched the right hand of the tyrant. But Augustine doesn't accept this rather generous interpretation, for it seems to be at odds with what we are told in Scripture. That is, that nothing happens outside the boundaries of divine providence. So we must consider even the rule of the wicked to be sanctioned or at least allowed by God, and perhaps for reasons inexplicable to us. Okay, so I'm going to skip over part of my argument, which I think I can do without harming the argument, because what I wanted, the part I'm skipping over is really an analysis of Augustine's account of the will, largely in Book 14, and it's not a political reading; it's a theological reading, and his conclusion is that the domination of lust, and there are many different kinds of lust, he says, right? There's a lust for money, a lust for power, etc. That lust is simply a desire for something more, right? And that this is characteristic of all forms of lust. And his point, the large point, is that he's making there is human freedom requires overcoming those passions. And I think one of the striking things about that whole account, which he gives, so books 11 through 14 are about the fall and how to understand that. So he ends book 14 really just at the beginning of Genesis. He's still at the beginning of Genesis. I mean, after the fall. But one of the striking things to me is that in that account in 11 to 14, he says almost nothing about grace. it's as if he's trying to make the most natural or rational argument about trying to understand human limitations without referring to the necessity of grace. Of course, he talks about grace in many other works, but he says almost nothing about it here. And again, it's almost well, I'll leave it at that. Again, it's almost as if he's just trying to provide us with a way of philosophically, theoretically understanding the human condition and what we need to do to improve that condition as individually, right, on the individual basis. But I do want to say, I do want to make this point before leaving this question of his treatment of the Romans in Book 5 and in Books 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Roman greats, rulers and warriors, and the self-sacrifice that they engaged in for the good of the city. And because there's in reflecting on what he has had to say about the desire for glory, there is in Plutarch's account of the life of Agis, right? So Plutarch contrasts Agis and Cleomenes with the Gracchi, Tiberius and Caius Gracchus. At the very beginning of the life of Agis, Plutarch comments on the manner in which potential leaders often give themselves over to the whims of the populace as a way of securing power and influence. And his point is to suggest how problematic this can be. And of course, he's referring to the four lives that he's going to talk about here. And what he says is this: and this in truth is the experience of public men who act in conformity with the desires and impulses of multitudes, making themselves attendants and slaves in order that they may be called popular leaders and rulers. For just as a ship's lookout, who sees what lies ahead before the ship's captain does, nevertheless turns to him for orders and does what he ordains, so the public man whose eyes are fixed on glory is a servant of the multitude. And then he says, the man indeed whose goodness is complete and perfect will have no need at all of glory. Will have no need at all of glory, except so far as glory gives him access to achievement by reason of the confidence men have in him. Yeah, I think that's right. So I wonder what we might make of this claim by Plutarch. In particular, the claim that the virtuous man, quote, will have no need at all of glory, unquote. Because Plutarch qualifies the claim, I think, in an important way. It may be largely true that true goodness does not have a need for glory. But as he notes, it may be useful, so far as glory gives him access to achievement by reason of the confidence men have in him. That is, glory can in fact be a useful thing, and especially for someone who wants to exercise rule over others. If we reject the exercise of rule itself as a necessary or desirable engagement on the part of Christians, then perhaps we can properly jettison the notion of glory as antithetical to Christian concerns. But if ruling is not to be abandoned, and I'm asserting it's not for Augustine, then one might have to think further about the significance of glory or reputation and what role it plays in human interaction. Augustine has told us in numerous places that the characteristic of the Romans was their love of glory and the accompanying pride. But we also know that not all pride is to be rejected. For some who are animated by pride are willing to suppress other passions as a means of achieving the glory that they seek. As Plutarch suggests to us, even if only in a subtle manner, sometimes pride is in fact a useful political quality. Before we conclude it, it's worthwhile, I think, returning to the argument of Book 2, where Augustine, at the end of his treatment of the question of whether Rome ever was a republic, tells us that he will return to that question later. And he does, in Book 19, written, we think, perhaps 15 years later. I suggested earlier that if one only focused on that earlier discussion, one might be led to question the relative importance attached to the question of regimes for Augustine or for Christianity at large. In Book 19, Augustine repeats some of what he said concerning Cicero's analysis of the Roman Republic, or Scipio's analysis in the Dialogue, De Republica, and concludes that Rome was never a republic because it was never characterized by justice. Why? Because justice, he says, requires giving each his due, but Rome never gave God his due, so it failed in a most fundamental way. But he doesn't end there. In chapter 24, he suggests we might adopt an alternative understanding of a republic or of a people. And if we do that, we might make headway in more fully assessing the relative goodness of Rome and indeed of every other regime. And he puts it this way. So if we use a different definition, he says, but if a people is defined in another way, not the Scipionic way, if we say, for instance, that a people is a multitude of rational beings joined together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love, okay, that a people is a multitude of rational beings joined together by common agreement on the objects of their love, leaving off here the question of justice, which was included in the first definition. The character of any people, we should take a close look at what it loves. End of quote. So we can call the multitude of people, even in the absence of a concern for justice. And we can judge the relative goodness of the people on the basis of what they love. He puts it, the better the objects of his love, the better the people. And the worse the objects of his love, the worse the people. And Augustine notes that what he has said about the Roman Republic can be said about the Greeks, the Egyptians, and any other people. That is, that we can use the criteria he sets forth here to assess the relative goodness of their political order. So while he earlier seems to have largely abandoned the question of how one distinguishes between and among regimes, here he provides us a new set of criteria for doing so. Now, though, it's not grounded in the question of justice, but the analysis of political orders is grounded instead on the order of things that are loved by the city. Right? The love of higher goods in the latter of being marks a city as superior to one that loves lesser goods. And all cities, he says, can now be judged by this criteria. One might say, in a sense, the Augustinian sense, this is a stricter gradation of regimes. And then one aside, but I think it's a crucial question, and maybe we can talk about it in the question and answer period, because it's not relevant to Augustine's argument, but in a way it is. So on the larger question of tyranny, I think that I think it's the case that in the modern world, we seem to have vastly expanded the understanding of tyranny. Or to put it differently, we have vastly limited the understanding of what's not tyranny, right? Or what is legitimate government. A passage I have in mind here is from Publius, the American Publius, writing in the Federalist Papers, where when he introduces the question of the separation of powers, he says, the absence of the separation of powers is the very definition of tyranny. It's very interesting. And I think it has important consequences for thinking about the larger question of what is tyrannical and what is not. But let me end with a return to Augustine and his concerns. I think one would have to conclude that it is true that for Augustine, the political world and its focused concern with questions of political order, hierarchy, legitimacy, regime analysis, and political freedom are not the primary concern. The status of the human soul, instead, and its right ordering, intended to be in harmony with the created order in order to reach its ultimate destiny, that question is the question of the first order. But we would be misled, I think, were we to dismiss the political questions as irrelevancies for Augustine. His conclusion, which I think is a measured conclusion, it seems, is to place the question of human freedom finally as a theological question, driven by the terms of salvation and membership in the city of God. But the very attention he gives to understanding the events of human history even if that interpretation is often tentative. He routinely notes, for example, that there may very well be better readings of the events he's commented on. That attention that he gives to such actions, I think that alone seems to rebut any ready dismissal of the relative importance of those events for us. Surely his own affiliation with the Roman Empire and the role it plays in the lives of his congregation and readers speaks of its importance to him. And the fact that God chose the empire as the vehicle for the incarnation cements, I think, the significance of the historical events which he catalogs and critiques. And with that, I'll finish and I'll be happy to answer any questions, take any comments or criticisms, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation of, rather broad presentation of Augustine's views of politics in general terms, but also more specifically focused on the question of tyranny, freedom, justice in political life and otherwise. So thank you. And if anyone has a question or a comment, please you can raise your hand using the icons which are just above the screen with the people present here, or you can just start speaking. I guess it should work as well. So would like to start. Maybe while others are thinking about a possible question, I would like to make a point on something that you said towards the end of the lecture, namely when you showed how Augustine is sort of negotiating his definitions of what a republic is, or so this is interesting. I think throughout the City of God, like Augustine. So for me, I'm interested in what would you think about this? For me, this is deeply Platonic, even though from what we know, Augustine most certainly haven't read actually Plato's Republic, because of his command of Greek wasn't that good, even though it wasn't non-existent, it seems. But he surely knew Cicero's writings very, very well. And I think we can safely assume that he heard about Plato's ideas from this source or another. So the fact that he didn't read it, that doesn't make it completely alien to his thinking. Because on the one hand, he makes those very rigorous claims of what the state is. So he says, if it's not a just state, it's not a state. And this is, I think, in a way similar to what Plato does, because Plato in the Republic describes an ideal state, which is in heaven with the gods and so on. And then, but then of course, he realizes that the actual states are not like that. So this is I think the Platonic element here. And then Augustine starts to negotiate and say, okay, so we can have that. So possibly we can agree that in our actual fallen condition, we can have the ideal, but we can have something, and we can see how close this is to the ideal. Because what you said, that his second definition of a republic is focused on the common love of which joins people. I think this is also a very Platonic way of thinking, because when you read Plato's Republic, Plato, on the one hand, of course, he says the only good state is a state which is a just state. But on the other hand, Plato also makes remarks like, well, oligarchy, it's not really a state because it's two states in one, because you have those two groups of people. Or democracy is bad because people have so many different views, opinions, desires. So Plato seems to think about a state or a republic, as Cicero would call it, in terms of its unity versus fragmentation. And I think Augustine is using the same way of thinking, and I'm interested if you would agree with it. So for Augustine, the degree of unity, even if it's an imperfect unity, is a very important political good.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. Really interesting. Yeah, I think it is true. So Augustine's knowledge of Plato, as you note, is limited. He does make a passing comment in Book 8 that Plato's fondness for Socrates led him to make Socrates the main speaker in almost all of his dialogue. So he's at least familiar with a Platonic dialogue that Socrates is not in. But yeah, he and his the comments that he makes about Plato's critique of the poets, for example, are sort of general comments that you could get from other writings, including from Cicero. And it's also true that so in the passages in Book 2 of the City of God, where Augustine is talking about Book 3 of Cicero's De Republica, I think it is the case that that's the source, our source for the excerpts that we have from Book 3 of the De Republica, that it was found in Cicero. I mean, in Augustine's account, because Scipio has a much longer critique in Book 1 of the multiplicity of regimes and the mixture account, so that Augustine, yeah, I think it's true. I would agree that he is looking for a sense of unity in the same way that Plato is looking for a sense of unity, and I think that leads him sometimes, like in the Book 19 passage, to say, okay, we're going to look for the one thing, you might say, right, that unites the people. What is the one thing that they love? Well, I mean, can we really say that about any particular political order, that there's one thing that it loves? Seems to me they're all complicated, right? There are many things which people love. He means, I guess, the primary thing, like what is it that they seek most of all? So whether it's money or imperialism or anything else, we could attribute that characteristic to it. But there is a seeming sense of trying to find that best order, the unity of a best order, which is, I think, always going to be slipping through our fingers, and I think is the reason why, is part of the reason why Aristotle critiques that notion in Book 2 of the Politics, is to say, let's strive for something more realizable. But I also think it's the case that Augustine's, I think, is political. There's a sense of political moderation that comes with recognizing the inherent limitations of any given political order, right? That is, you don't get a kind of ideology that might produce an extreme political situation. I think in the end, Augustine's teaching might push one in the direction of making modest reforms in the political order, but not revolutionary reforms.
Thank you. And I also, speaking of unity, I was thinking about his discussion of peace towards the end of the City of God, because he uses a biblical phrase, of course, for something. But when you look at how he understands peace, because he says peace can be a peace of the soul, a peace between man, a peace in any order. So for him, peace is basically unity. Or peace is is opposed to conflict, right, and strife, which is necessary, at least dualistic, if not a multiplicity of conflicting interests. So the decision he makes, so he says, okay, so we can't have justice, but at least we can have peace. This is also, for me, a deeply Platonic move, because for Plato, it seems, and at least from Aristotle's account, that the good was the one. So the sense that oneness, and of course in Augustine you have it too. So the insistence of the unity of God and its oneness versus fragmentation and multiplicity. So it's very striking how Augustine says that we humans, we are the most social species on Earth, but also we are the most querulous, fragmented. So he says we are all one because of Adam. So the whole humanity in a way is Adam. But so we're supposed to be the most social and communal species, but we are so horribly conflicted and fragmented. And so this is, I think it's even much more important for Augustine than it was for Plato for some reason. Maybe, you know, the time where he lived, time of chaos and fragmentation. But I think it's also very relevant to our period of history, where you can see how people are preoccupied with a sense of, you know, fragmentation, political divisiveness is a very emotionally important thing for people, and for Augustine it was too. I think.
I agree. Yeah, that account that he gives in the opening chapters of Book 19, leading up to that more extended discussion of peace. I mean, it seems to me it's somber. You know, the differences between and among people in the world, right, in your country, even in your own household. It's sobering. And he's obviously lamenting that, right? And so looking for some, as you say, rightly, I think, some notion of unity. And I wonder if it might be the case that that part of that is as well driven by the question of Christian universalism, right? Where there is an expectation of unity among all people, and that, I think, is so when you think about the differences between, or think of when I think of just the question of empire, you know, right? Aristotle has a critique of empire. Augustine has a critique of empire, but I don't know if it's for the same reason. That is Augustine's critique, I take it, is because of what produces empire, right? Is tension and anguish, etc. But there's also a desire for unity, world unity, right? So those two things, not, I'm going to say they're at odds with each other, but that conception of unity, which drives which might drive a Christian understanding, I think, is not the same that would drive a political understanding.
I could see that someone is having a question. Someone wrote something in a chat box. Am I correct? Is there any problem with speaking, or because I can see that Konstantin Pozinis is raising his hand, but I also saw someone writing something down. So if this person can raise their hand as well, that would be good. But okay, so Louis, you cannot turn your microphone. Okay, so I saw your question first, so I'll try to see, where is it? It's supposed to be written down somewhere. Okay. So the question is, could this be, oh, where is it? Sorry, I lost it again. So this is because, oh yeah, I can see that. So could this representation of Christianity, the question is, be related to the legal changes linked to the organization of the Theodosian Code, from a plurality of interpretations to a more coherent account? Yeah, so that's the question. I'm not sure if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, well, I get if taken.
Could you sorry? Could you, Louisa, right? Could you clarify a bit the issue of plurality of interpretations? If you could, you can write it down if you can turn on your microphone. Because from what I understand, it's a question. I mean, it's an attempt to link Augustine's reflections to the particularities of his of the political context of his time.
I guess I would. I mean, I'd say something about it, and that is, you know, certainly one of the difficulties that Augustine is facing is the seeming collapse of the empire, and so you've had the, you know, the polis come and go. You've had a large republic. Now you've got an empire, and what's going to happen at this point? And you see historically, right, politically, militarily, this disparity, disparate sources of power in different peoples and along the edges of the empire, and now the split between the East and the West. And the question, I think, is very large question is what's going to happen to Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, right? In the wake of the explosion of the Roman Empire. And Augustine is part. So this doesn't address the question of what happened subsequently, but I think it's an important one anyway. One of Augustine's major concerns, I think, is steeling Romans against despairing at the collapse of the empire, and he does that in part by distinguishing the church from the empire, right? So he's targeting the Eusebian view of marrying the two together, and the extensive praise of Constantine that Eusebius gives, and Augustine sees this sense of despair that's overcoming people, and he wants to say, look, you know, there's no necessary connection between the success of the church and the success of the Roman Empire. We have to look beyond the empire, and if it collapses, which there are some passages in the City of God where Augustine seems to suggest that the empire could recover, and might last longer. But if it collapses, it doesn't mean you know, the end of civilization, and it doesn't mean that the church has failed in any way.
Thank you. Yeah, and we have also a thank you from the person who asked the question. And now, Konstantin Bozinis, please turn on your microphone and camera to ask the question.
Hello. Can you listen to me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you also turn on your camera? Is it possible?
I don't think it's possible. Sorry.
Okay. We can hear you.
Yeah, the system doesn't give me this possibility to be connected to my camera. Sorry. I guess that you can at least listen to me. Yeah.
Yes, it's a little broken for me, but I can hear.
I will try to speak loudly.
Oh, that's much better. Yes.
That's much better. Firstly, I would like to thank from my part the colleague from the University of Dallas for his excellent presentation of Augustine's political thought. And I would like to pose a question. You know, Professor, the one thing that much impresses me personally in the De Civitate Dei of Augustine is the fact, as you mentioned in your presentation, that Augustine focused a lot, and especially in the first books of his work, on the Roman Republic. He makes a critique. He gives details about the different periods of the development of the Republic. He emphasized the characteristics of the prominent figures of this historical period of Rome. And in general, he speaks a lot about the Roman past. On the other hand, he makes only short references to the Roman Empire. He doesn't speak a lot about that, yeah. And as far as I know, he doesn't lay much emphasis on the personalities, I mean the emperors who led the Roman Empire through the ages. And I'm wondering, why is it that the case? Why Augustine, I can say, avoids to speak openly about the Roman Empire. I mean, the Roman Empire of the time of Principatus, yeah, the great Roman Empire, yeah, of the glorious dynasties of the past. And you know, I would say that he gives me sometimes the impression that the critic to the Roman Empire is a kind of Christian taboo. It's a taboo for the Christian thinker. So I would like to have your opinion about that.
Thank you, Constantine. That's a great comment, a great question. And I have an answer. It's not necessarily the right answer, but I have an answer, I think. And I would say this especially struck me the first time I went to Rome, because, you know, when you look at old Rome and then the Christian, you can't look anywhere and not see Constantine, like something that he did, you know. And how can you avoid that? And Augustine says so little about him. You know what he says. So he discusses him briefly in that Mirror of Princes passage at the end of Book 5, and what he notes about Constantine is that he founded a city, which of course he named after himself, without a pagan temple. That's what strikes Augustine to make that comment. So why does he do it? I think it might be connected to, again, this is an answer. I don't know that it's the right answer, but I think it might be connected to the whole theme of the distinction between the two cities in this way. In books 15 through 18, he says he's going to treat there. So in 11 to 14, he treats the origins of the two cities. And then 15 through 18, he treats the development or course of the two cities. And that ends, so the account of the two cities, right? So 15 through 17 is about Israel. And then 18, he gives his history of the world, right? Going back to the beginning, so non-Israel. And then he comes back to joining, where the two join each other again at the end of Book 18. And that account ends with the incarnation and passion and death and resurrection. And the reason for that, of Christ, and the reason for that is, I think, that beyond that, as he says many times, the two cities are intermingled in this world. And you can't tell, right, whether one is a member of one city or the other. We don't even know ourselves, right? Because whether one may fall or stand, we have no assurance of that. And so this world is always filled. So that would mean then the whole of the Roman Empire is characterized by this mixing or intermingling of the members of the two cities together. And so while he will sometimes say, he will say, the earthly city, that is Rome, right? He doesn't really mean that, right? I mean, in the same way that when he says the city of God, that is the church, he doesn't mean that either, because he tells us time and again, right? There are members of, physically members of the church who are even bound to us by the sacraments, he says at the end of book 1, who are not members of the city of God. And who may fall, and then there are those who are outside the city, the church, who will become members of the city of God. So we can't tell here and now. So the whole empire, period of the empire, is something of a mixed, it's a mixed circumstance. And it is clear. I think you're exactly right. He refrains from saying almost anything about the empire. He mentions, you know, I cited, he mentions Nero. It's in passing, though. You know, nothing any more detailed than that.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. And I wanted to ask you to expand a bit on a very interesting point you made, and I think it's not very often made, namely that for Plato it was enough to be a philosopher, a true philosopher, to be a good king or a good politician, right? Of course, it took decades of training, education, ascetic practice. So it wasn't about philosophical degree at a university. Let's be clear about this. But of course, a true philosopher. So a true philosopher would be someone who would naturally be an expert in the matter of the state, just as he, for Plato, is an expert in the matter of his own moral life, right? So for Plato, that's the same, because he sees the good, and if he sees the good, he just follows the good. He sees everything in the light of the good, so to speak. But you made the point that for Augustine, the political skill was something which didn't necessarily follow the fact that someone was pious or virtuous or just, from his point of view, of course, a Christian perspective. So I think it's very, very interesting. What came to my mind was actually the story of the abdication of Pope Celestine V in the 13th century. It's a very, I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with this story, but it's a very, very interesting story in the time when there was the growing sense of the corruption of the official church and even papacy, and especially Franciscans were very eager to deeply reform the official church. A very pious ascetic monk was elected Pope, Celestine V. But and the radical Franciscans, they were ecstatic, of course, because they thought he would completely transform the whole church and the world, because finally someone saintly was Pope. But Celestine began his papacy by saying that he doesn't have a lot of time because Advent is coming, and he plans to spend the whole Advent on his own in his cell praying. Of course, the whole curia was in complete dismay, and then he was forced to. He tries to flee. He abdicated. He was imprisoned, and then came Boniface VIII, who was, of course, Dante believed he was in hell and he was the worst pope ever. So this is a very interesting story. You can choose someone very saintly, but then he is completely incapable of even ruling the Roman Curia and, of course, the Papal States and all of it. So could you expand on this point about Augustine's view of that?
Yeah, just to follow up on that first, I don't think that there is in the history of the Catholic Church any category in considering the cause of sainthood for thinking about whether or not one was a good administrator. I just think it's irrelevant, and for good reason. Sanctity doesn't necessarily bring that. I guess I would say I think that maybe here Augustine might be influenced by Cicero. I'd have to go back and examine it, but that is if there's a particular passage or reference that I find. But think of Cicero's comments at the opening of Book 1 of the De Republica, speaking in his own name, right, where he's criticizing the philosophers. And one of the criticisms that he makes is they don't think about politics, right? So that's it's a certain school, you might say, of philosophy, right? And I think that's not just, it would not justly be applied to Plato. But one of the arguments he makes is that he says they say that they're not gonna get involved in politics, but when they're needed, when there's an emergency, then they will come in and help. And the point that Cicero makes is they won't be able to because they won't know anything about politics, right? They'll come in and make a mess of it because they haven't studied it, and it's important to study it. Of course, he's talking about his own preparation for success there, but I think there's some truth to that, and I think from Augustine's point of view, he does think that, and now having the experience, of course, is not sufficient to make one a good ruler, because there's lots of examples of bad rulers who had long experience even. But the absence of attention to that, the acquiring of those skills is I think not helpful to political rulers, and and I think the larger question really is to think about how, as I mentioned in my talk, how we might assess those qualities and how one acquires them independent of any Christian conception. Like, is there just what we might call a natural skill for ruling that isn't dependent upon any kind of act of faith or grace or acceptance of anything? Is there a way we can just think about someone who has the capacity to rule and someone who doesn't, and it's not dependent upon a particular religious or Christian conception?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, that would make perfect sense. I mean, Plato criticizes this view. He says that those who, he tells this story about Thales, the first philosopher who was watching the stars and fell into a hole in the ground, and he says this is how we are seen by others, but this is not true, of course. But you're right that the Romans had a very different view of that.
Yeah, and isn't the example that Aristotle gives, isn't it of Thales capturing of his acquiring the monopoly and making money off of this, right? And so part of the point of it, I think Aristotle's point is to show, no, the guy knows what he's doing, right? He knows how to do it. He just doesn't do it because that's not what a philosopher would do. But you have to show that you could do it. Because that shows the people that you actually know what you're doing.
And actually, another interesting thing is that Augustine himself was a very, very good politician. As a bishop in his own time, when a bishop had to be a politician, with the collapse of the political system, bishops became local leaders basically. So Augustine was very, very efficient, and he had very difficult things to solve, like the Donatist controversy and other stuff like that. And he was a rather nuanced, flexible, not very rigid, and quite, I think, intuitively very, very good politician. And also, and his teacher, Saint Ambrose, he was elected bishop precisely because of the political skills the people of Milan wanted Ambrose not because he was a saintly Christian, he wasn't even baptized, but he was so successful in politics that they made him a bishop. So that's also I think worth of considering how the political reality of Augustine's time may have contributed to this point.
Yes, yeah, I have that wonderful painting of Van Dyck and Ambrose and Theodosius at the door of the cathedral, and keeping him out. So he knew how to deal with emperors even.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see anyone else raising their hands, so I think we can wrap up. And oh yeah, there's another question from Stylianos Tellus.
Hello, thank you very much
Hello.
for this conversation. I'm very sorry about my camera. I have only one simple question. As you said, we have the city of God and the city of man. These two cities have an alliance in the human history. Is the city of man the same with the state, or are they different? Two different institutions, so that the city of man can use the government to force the city of God, for example, to worship idols or something else. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would say that both cities. Well, let's just stick with the city of man. Yeah, the city of man is not identical to the state because it transcends the borders or boundaries of any state. So the city of man is really whether one belongs to the city of God or the city of man, in Augustine's view, is identifiable by the orientation of one's soul. So if the orientation of the soul is towards God, one is a member of the city of God. If the orientation is towards self, then one is a member of the city of man. And you find those people, members of the city of God and the city of man, everywhere, in every state. So one can't say that Rome, as I mentioned before, Rome is the city of man. Now Augustine does say that, but I don't think he means it that way when he says it. Rome is the most obvious representation of the city of man in the way that it orients itself towards its self-promotion and that sort of thing. But is it in itself the perfect embodiment of the city of man? The answer has to be no, because there are members of the city of man who are not Roman. In the same way, there are members of the city of God who ultimately who are not in the church. So there's no ready identification with that. So it's always the case that I think in Augustine's view, it's always the case you will find members of those two cities anywhere and everywhere. Even, by the way, so this is true even in the Old Testament, because he tells us that we normally would identify Israel with the city of God, but he gives us an example of Job, who is not an Israelite, he says, but is clearly meant to be depicted as a member of the city of God. So then we might think, well, are there others like Job?
I think the part of the question was also how can political power influence the city of God? But well, the city of God is not an institution; it's not identical to the church. So it's yeah, it's impossible. I mean, because the state doesn't even know who is a member of the city of God.
Correct. Yeah, I think I agree.
Interesting question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I think it was. Thank you very much, Richard, for your lecture and for the Q&A. I think it was a very good beginning of the whole series, when we will sort of look at the ancient classical heritage, Christian contribution, and how it developed. Of course, Augustine was the figure of the utmost importance for the medieval thought. But next time we will have an opportunity to hear a lecture about Saint Gregory of Nyssa, which I think it will be also an interesting perspective from the Eastern Greek part of the Roman Empire, and then we will travel further into early Middle Ages and High Middle Ages and late Middle Ages. So it looks like a very interesting trip ahead of us. So thank you very much, Richard, for setting us off.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. So and thank you very much for the audience for being there. And yeah, so if you want to stay in touch, just send me an email, and I will keep you posted on the next lectures. So thank you again, and see you.
Thank you.